Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
My parents bought my sister a house. Me? I never even got a bed frame from them. That was the exact thought running through my mind as I sat at their kitchen table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug I had probably used since high school, while across from me, Emily held up glossy photos of the three-bedroom colonial Mom and Dad had just helped her and Ryan get into. I could hear Mom's voice, high and proud, as she said, "We just wanted to give them a real start, something solid, you know? A place where they can raise their kids without worrying about rent." Dad chuckled as if the decision were obvious, natural, almost noble. I smiled because I had to, because the alternative would have been letting my jaw drop and blurting out the only words I could think. What about me? It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. I'd spent years training myself not to expect anything from them, years convincing myself that their constant dismissals of my needs were simply a quirk of family dynamics, not a verdict on my worth. But in that moment, as my mother bragged about the hardwood floors and the renovated kitchen Emily would now have thanks to their generosity, a deep, bitter weight settled in my chest. It wasn't the house itself. It was the confirmation of a lifetime of favoritism, a verdict that had been delivered quietly in little ways over decades, and now was declared in flashing neon letters. She is worth investing in. You are not. I thought back to the first time I asked for help as an adult. I was 22, just out of college, struggling to cover rent after my roommate bailed on me mid-lease. I had swallowed my pride and called my parents, explaining the situation, half hoping they'd offer even a couple $100s to keep me afloat. My father's voice had been sharp. "You're independent, aren't you? You'll figure it out." My mother had chimed in with her soft, but dismissive tone. "We can't always bail you out, honey. You have to learn." I did learn. I worked double shifts at the diner, lived on boxed mac and cheese, and quietly vowed never to put myself in that humiliating position again. Meanwhile, Emily's car had broken down that same year, and Dad had written her a check for a new one without so much as a conversation. Sitting at that table now, watching them beam at Emily as if she were the shining centerpiece of their entire legacy, I realized something had hardened inside me over the years. I had learned how to take their scraps of approval, their occasional phone calls, their obligatory birthday cards with $20 tucked in, and pretend it was enough. I had told myself that being independent was a badge of honor, that I didn't want their help anyway. But the truth was uglier. I had wanted it, I had needed it, and they had denied it because, in their eyes, my needs weren't worth the sacrifice. Emily looked over at me as if expecting me to gush with congratulations. Her husband Ryan even gave me that smug grin, the one that said, "We both know your parents like me more than they like you." I forced my lips into a smile that didn't reach my eyes and said, "Wow, that's amazing. A whole house." The words tasted like ash, but no one noticed. They were too busy passing the photos around, marveling at the granite countertops and the backyard big enough for barbecues and birthday parties. It struck me then how invisible I had become in my own family. My achievements, my struggles, my sacrifices, none of it seemed to register. I had paid off my student loans without help, worked my way up in a job I created from scratch, survived heartbreak and disappointment without leaning on anyone, and still, none of that was worth as much as Emily's potential. They called me independent because it excused them from ever having to care. They could cloak their neglect in the language of pride. "She doesn't need us, she's strong." And I had played along for too long. That night, when the dishes were done and Emily had left with her glossy folder of home inspection notes, I lingered in the kitchen while Mom wiped down the counters. She was humming under her breath, light and content, as if nothing monumental had just happened. I wanted to ask her if she remembered the time I had to pawn my grandmother's necklace to cover a security deposit, if she remembered the tears I had shed on the phone when I begged for help. I wanted to shake her and demand, why her and not me? But I said nothing. Silence had become my habit, my armor. Instead, I waited until Dad shuffled back into the room, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and made a joke about how he hoped Emily appreciated the down payment because we can't do this for everyone. He didn't even glance at me when he said it. I laughed, though nothing was funny, and felt a strange calm settle over me. Because in that moment, something clicked. I realized I would never win their approval, never balance the scales by arguing or pleading. They had made their choice. And so, I would make mine. I smiled as I gathered my purse and coat, kissed Mom on the cheek, and said goodnight. They thought I was leaving quietly, retreating into my usual silence, but inside, the decision was already forming, sharp and certain. I was done playing the overlooked daughter, the independent afterthought. If they wanted Emily to be the golden child, fine. Let her shine. But when the lights went out and the will was read, when the balance of everything they thought was secure shifted beneath their feet, they would remember me. I closed the door behind me, the cool night air brushing against my face, and whispered to myself words I had never dared speak aloud. That's when I decided I was done being invisible. The housewarming came with paper lanterns strung across Emily's new backyard like store-bought constellations, a rented bouncy castle that squeaked in that high rubbery way every time one of the kids launched off a wall, and a buffet of catered sliders Mom kept arranging with the kind of anxious perfectionism she usually reserved for holiday tables, and as I carried in the oversized wrapped box I had labeled for the happy homeowners, I felt the familiar choreography of our family lock-into place, with everyone drifting into their assigned roles, Dad at the grill turning things he wasn't actually cooking, Mom fluttering from tray to tray, Emily holding court in the shade with a glass of sparkling something while Ryan explained mortgage rates to a cousin as if he had personally invented the concept of fixed interest. I moved among the aunts and neighbors with the smooth smile I had learned to wear years ago, the one that never lets on that you are taking notes, and when I set my gift on the patio table I heard my mother's laugh, soft, apologetic, almost conspiratorial, flowed across the lawn as she told Aunt Denise that I was so independent it's almost a problem, because they never knew what to do for me, never knew how to help someone who wouldn't ask, and if I wanted anything I had always figured it out. Which sounded like praise if you didn't know the history, but to me landed like a practiced excuse for neglect wrapped in pretty tissue paper. I stood there long enough to hear Dad add that Emily just needs a little more support right now, with the kids and Ryan starting his business, and we're lucky your sister's so strong she doesn't need us in the same way. A sentence that cleared them of guilt and pinned a badge of resilience to my chest in one effortless motion, and I realized how efficient their narrative had become. How it let them feel generous and modern and loving while placing me outside the circle where generosity was distributed, and for a second I tasted the old metallic tang of humiliation. The one from the year I sold my grandmother's necklace to cover a security deposit while they sent Emily and Ryan on an anniversary weekend to a wine country bed and breakfast. When the speeches began, because of course there were speeches at a backyard party, Ryan raised his glass and thanked my parents for believing in us, and Mom dabbed her eyes and said family is what makes houses into homes, and Dad, who loves ceremony, gestured for me to say something, which was my cue to step into the light and do the one thing I could do better than all of them, namely smile with my mouth while my mind built scaffolding around the next move. So I lifted the lid of the big gift box and pulled out a polished wooden binder with brass corners and a neat title plate that read, "The Memory Ledger," explaining in a warm voice that I had made them a keepsake so they could remember this beautiful day and all the ways we show up for each other. And at that phrase I watched Ryan's eyes narrow just a fraction, because he has the instincts of a man who thinks every room is a negotiation. The guests laughed when I flipped it open to a page labeled Housewarming, where I had tucked photos from that afternoon printed on a little portable printer, and then they laughed again, a little uncertain this time. When I turned the next page, and there was a scanned copy of a check from years ago for Emily's down payment on her first car, and then a Venmo screenshot titled Emergency Dentist. And then an airline confirmation for a trip my parents had gifted when Emily needed a break. Each item recorded with dates and little captions in my neat handwriting, the whole thing presented like a family scrapbook, except the story it told was not about love in the general sense, but about where love had been measured out in dollars. And as the air around the table shifted, I kept my voice light and said I hoped this would help them look back and feel proud of everything they had invested in our family, the words doing double duty as a compliment and a forensic report. Mom's smile went a shade tight. Dad chuckled in a way that meant he was not amused, and Emily let out that breathy little laugh she uses when she is deciding whether to be offended or to pretend she isn't. And I closed the binder with a clap that felt almost ceremonial, then hugged my mother and told her I could help them tidy their paperwork later, since keeping track of all those documents was obviously getting unwieldy. And I saw the exact moment the offer landed like a solution to a problem. She hadn't confessed out loud because she hates the piles that accumulate in their hall cabinet and hates even more that my father insists he knows where everything is when he absolutely does not. So after the cake was cut and the last neighbor had collected her Tupperware and the lanterns buzzed with sleepy moths, I followed my parents back to their house under the pretext of helping them carry leftover platters. And while Dad poured nightcaps and Mom kicked off her shoes with a grateful sigh, I slid the ledger onto their kitchen counter and said we could start a real file system. The kind that separated tax documents from insurance policies and kept the estate papers in one safe place. And when Dad grumbled about lawyers complicating simple things, I agreed with him in that soothing tone that works on stubborn men, then asked him to bring me the lockbox from his closet so we could make a quick index, which he did because he likes being useful and because I have always been the quiet one who fixes things without drama. I did not change anything that night. I did not need to, because the small revenge I had engineered, the elegant mirror held up in the form of a gift, that cataloged their choices and forced them to sit with the arithmetic of their favoritism while I politely offered administrative rescue, had already loosened the lid on the jar. And as I wrote a tidy list of contents on a yellow pad, I took my time handling each envelope so my fingerprints would be exactly where they needed to be later, noting the age of the notarizations and the lawyer's letterhead and the fact that their witnesses were both neighbors who spent winters in Florida, which would matter if anyone ever wanted to redo anything in a hurry. And when Mom finally declared herself exhausted and Dad said we would finish another day, I tucked the index card into the lockbox, clicked it shut, and memorized the weight of it in my hands the way a pianist memorizes the distance between keys. On my way out, I scheduled a reminder on Dad's phone, something innocuous named flu paperwork, on the same day I knew his attorney ran free consult hours for seniors, and I kissed my mother's cheek and thanked her for letting me help. And as the door closed behind me and the hallway light cut across the tiles like a seam, I told myself that ledger had been both a kindness and a reckoning, a joke with teeth, and that by the time those lanterns in Emily's yard came down, the first thread of their story would already be pulled, because next week, without anyone realizing how the appointment got there, Dad would be sitting across from a man who loved tidy files as much as I did, and I would be in the chair beside him with my pen uncapped and my hands steady. When Dad's phone buzzed with that little calendar reminder labeled flu paperwork, he grunted in annoyance, but because it was early morning and his coffee had only just started to kick in, he handed the phone to Mom and told her to call the office to confirm whatever it was, and that was how the appointment landed on the books without him even asking what exactly he had agreed to. A week later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of their car, flipping through a manila folder of documents like the dutiful daughter they thought I was, while Dad grumbled about traffic and Mom fussed with her lipstick in the mirror, both of them assuming that I had organized the entire trip to make their lives easier. In a way, I had. The attorney's office was tucked inside a renovated Victorian with creaky wooden floors and the smell of lemon oil hanging in the air, and when the receptionist asked whether we were there to review estate planning, I caught the slight flicker of recognition in Mom's eyes, the kind of flicker that comes when you realize you have left something neglected for too long. Dad chuckled and muttered something about keeping things neat, and I could see in his posture that he was proud to be proactive, even though he had stumbled into the appointment by accident. I sat between them in the waiting room with the folder on my lap, my heart beating with a slow, deliberate rhythm, because I knew that what looked like ordinary paperwork to them was, to me, the scaffolding of a very different future. When the attorney greeted us, he shook hands with Dad, gave Mom that reassuring nod older professionals always save for anxious women, and then turned to me with a polite smile, assuming I was there only to keep my parents organized. I returned the smile and let him believe that, because underestimation was my most reliable camouflage. As we followed him into the office lined with law books and diplomas, I noticed the heavy safe tucked behind his desk, the kind of safe that promised both permanence and secrecy. And I felt the first surge of adrenaline that comes not from risk, but from the certainty that risk has finally become useful. The conversation began with pleasantries, with Dad making jokes about not planning to kick the bucket anytime soon and Mom saying she only wanted to make sure everything was fair. I let them talk, watching their faces, memorizing the way their words bent around the old patterns of favoritism that had shaped my life. The attorney asked about assets, about the house, about savings accounts and insurance policies, and I laid the folder open on the polished desk, sliding documents across at exactly the right moment so it looked as though I were simply keeping things orderly. I noticed the way the attorney glanced at me with growing respect, as if realizing that I was not just there to take notes, but to make sure nothing fell through the cracks. My parents leaned on that assumption without even realizing it, giving me space to position myself as the indispensable interpreter between their bumbling pride and the attorney's meticulous questions. It was during a pause, when Dad excused himself to use the restroom and Mom adjusted her cardigan nervously, that the attorney asked if there were any specific changes they wanted to make in terms of beneficiaries. Mom hesitated, looked at me, and then said, almost reflexively, "We just want it balanced, but Emily has the kids, so maybe she needs a little more support." She said it lightly, but it landed like a sentence carved into stone. I kept my expression neutral, my voice calm, as I leaned forward and asked the attorney to note that fairness could also mean ensuring long-term stability for both daughters, since independence sometimes hid burdens no one else could see. The attorney nodded. Mom looked relieved at the diplomatic phrasing, and when Dad returned, the conversation had already shifted to the next form. By the time the papers were signed, updated, and sealed in the office safe, my fingerprints were on every page, not in ink but in influence, each suggestion carefully framed as practicality, each adjustment positioned as clarity. My parents thanked me on the way out, Dad clapping me on the shoulder like I had saved him from some terrible chore, Mom telling me she didn't know how she would have managed without my organized brain. I smiled, tucked the folder back into my bag, and let them believe they had been responsible adults handling their own affairs, when in truth, they had walked through a door I had built for them, into a future that now tilted subtly, almost imperceptibly, in my favor. That night, lying in bed with the folder spread out beside me, I studied the copies the attorney had given us, running my fingers over the embossed letterhead and the fresh signatures. For the first time, I let myself wonder not whether I could pull this off, but whether I had already crossed a line I could never return from. I reminded myself that I hadn't lied, not exactly, and that all I had done was ensure my voice was in the room where decisions had been made. Still, the thought lingered like a whisper in the dark. If fairness required manipulation to exist, was it still fairness, or had I simply become the architect of a different kind of injustice? I closed the folder, set it on the nightstand, and stared at the ceiling until the first light of dawn crept across the room, steady and inevitable, like the future I had already begun to write in ink my parents would never be able to erase. When Emily called to say she was pregnant again, the news spread through the family chat like gospel, followed within minutes by a string of heart emojis from Mom, a "so proud of you both" from Dad, and an invitation to a casual little brunch. That was anything but. The brunch took place at Emily's house, the house my parents had bought her, and as I pulled up that morning, I counted no fewer than 5 cars in the driveway and a few more along the curb. Inside, the smell of cinnamon rolls and fresh flowers clung to every corner, and a giant gold baby banner drooped slightly over the entryway table stacked with gift bags and pastel cards, even though Emily was only in her second trimester. She wore a silky cream dress that floated around her belly like a stage curtain, and when she hugged me, her smile flickered with the same performative warmth I had seen her give to her sorority sisters at parent weekends in college, the kind of smile that says, "I know I've already won, but let's not say it out loud." I watched Mom drift from guest to guest like the hostess she wasn't supposed to be, arms full of plates, eyes scanning every surface for crumbs or smudges, while Dad held court in the corner, telling old stories about Emily's childhood like he was warming up the crowd for a speech. And, through it all, Not once, not even as I helped Mom reheat the quiche or found the missing bottle opener in the junk drawer, did either of them say thank you, or ask how I was doing, or even seem to notice that I had arrived early, stayed late, and kept the entire circus from collapsing under its own self-importance. Later, as Emily unwrapped a silver-engraved baby spoon from Aunt Lynn, Dad cleared his throat and announced, with a glance at Mom for approval, that they'd be covering the costs of a nursery remodel, top to bottom, of course, because that's what family does. The room broke into polite applause, and I felt a strange detachment settle over me, as though I were watching a play I had seen too many times, the lines predictable, the actors overly rehearsed, the ending inevitable. I stood there, holding an empty glass, realizing that my parents had stopped seeing me not just as a daughter, but as a useful background character in someone else's narrative. On the surface, nothing changed after that day. I still called once a week. I still showed up to birthday dinners, still helped Mom reset her Wi-Fi, still emailed Dad articles about tax planning he never read. But in the quiet hours between those rituals, I was busy laying groundwork. I had begun to meet with a different attorney, one who didn't work in the same quaint office as the family lawyer, one who specialized in discreet revisions, strategic redirections, and legal opacity that was both technically ethical and extremely effective. We went through the documents line by line. I asked questions that would have made my parents' heads spin. I requested language so dense with clauses and contingencies that even Emily's husband, who had once bragged about doing their own taxes, would need a paid expert just to interpret the fine print. I wasn't stealing. That's the part one clung to when guilt scratched at the edge of my mind. I wasn't deleting Emily from the will, wasn't leaving her penniless or disinherited. All I was doing was correcting an imbalance that had calcified over decades, redirecting equity not just of finances, but of legacy. Because if money was how my parents measured love, if homes and remodels and tuition and trust funds were how they declared worth, then I was simply answering them in the only language they had ever truly respected. One clause allowed for discretionary distribution of assets based on need, but added a definition of need so strict it would disqualify anyone who owned property within the last 10 years. Another section transferred controlling interest of their investments into a managed trust, one in which I had been quietly named the primary trustee. And buried near the end, surrounded by innocuous language about tax protections and investment vehicles, was a clause granting me power of interpretation over ambiguous intent. A legal sleight of hand that meant if anything were questioned after they were gone, I, not Emily, not Ryan, not the cousin who liked to play mediator, would be the final voice on what our parents would have wanted. The documents were not signed yet. That part came later. But the blueprint was finished. The path had been cleared. All that remained was for the inevitable passage of time to do its work, to let my parents believe everything was in place exactly as they had instructed, while the reality bent gently but irrevocably in another direction. I had built the system they trusted, convinced them it was their own, and now I simply had to wait for the day when that trust would become binding. I remember leaving the attorney's office on the final day of edits, stepping into the sunlight with the folder under my arm, feeling the strange, calm gravity of what I had done. It was not joy. It was not triumph. It was something colder, cleaner, a kind of justice that didn't sparkle, but settled like dust. And as I walked back to my car, I imagined the exact moment years from now, maybe months, when the truth would land in Emily's lap, when the attorney would read the updated terms, and her smile would falter as she flipped through the pages she hadn't expected to see. That moment played in my mind like a scene on loop, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because I wanted, finally, to be seen. Not as the background character, not as the reliable one, but as the person who had, in the end, outmaneuvered them all. The morning my father collapsed in the driveway was not dramatic in the way people expect life-changing moments to be. There was no thunderstorm overhead, no heart-wrenching final words or poetic symmetry. There was just the silence of a quiet cul-de-sac, a tipped-over coffee mug on the pavement, and the startled shouts of a neighbor out walking her dog. When the call came, I was already halfway through a spreadsheet at work, eyes blurred from too much screen time, my phone buzzing against the corner of my desk like a reminder I hadn't asked for. By the time I reached the hospital, the emergency had stabilized into what doctors blandly described as a major warning, which really meant this isn't the end, but it could have been. He was conscious, tired, groggy from medication, and already trying to joke about hospital food when I stepped into the room. My mother looked smaller than I remembered her, slumped in a chair beside him, her hands worrying the corner of a worn tissue. Her expression caught between fear and the exhaustion of a long marriage. What neither of them knew, what no one in the family suspected, was that this moment, so saturated with mortality and reflection, was also the trigger point. According to the legal structure we'd set in motion, any major medical emergency, particularly one involving cardiovascular complications and requiring hospitalization beyond 48 hours, automatically escalated the Trust's transition protocol. That clause had been inserted with surgical precision, surrounded by enough legalese to appear like a minor technicality, but it was the quiet detonator behind the entire mechanism. While my father recovered and my mother fluttered between gratitude and quiet panic, a simple email had already been sent to the firm that managed their financial instruments. No dramatic meeting. No ceremony. Just an automated trigger and a confirmation of process. It took less than 3 days for the documents to be finalized. I received the notification via encrypted client portal access, a calm, clinical acknowledgement that the trust had now transferred its primary administrative privileges to me. I sat on the edge of my bed in silence for almost an hour after reading it, not because I had doubts, but because the absence of any real emotion disturbed me more than if I had felt guilt, or triumph, or anything at all. The decision had never been about feelings, it had been about architecture, about structure, about rewriting a system that had always favored convenience over fairness. And now that it had happened, I wasn't sure what scared me more, the possibility that I'd gone too far, or the fact that I felt nothing at all. Emily arrived at the hospital a few days later, all wind chime earrings and performative concern, breezing into the room with that overcompensating energy people summon when they know they've arrived late to something that matters. She kissed Dad's forehead, brought Mom a new cardigan in case the AC was too much, and handed the nurses a box of chocolates like she was auditioning for the role of devoted daughter. I let her take the spotlight, sat back in the chair beside the window, nodded along with her updates about the kids, the remodel, the morning sickness, and Ryan's new client. None of it mattered now. I had stepped out of that play. My lines were no longer written by anyone else. The real moment came 2 weeks later when my parents, both home and recovering, called a family dinner that was clearly meant to reestablish control. We gathered around their table, the same one where, over the years, countless small betrayals had unfolded beneath layers of polite conversation and overcooked roast beef. Emily arrived in a floral dress that likely cost more than my month's rent, her bump now prominent, her husband trailing behind like an accessory. My father cleared his throat over dessert and said, with a vague weight in his voice, that he wanted to talk about the will, about making sure things were clear, just in case something happens again. My mother nodded solemnly, folding her napkin with trembling hands, and for a moment, I almost believed they had come to some realization, some reckoning about what had been broken for so long. But then Dad said, "We've always trusted you to handle the messy parts," and Mom added, "We just want to make sure Emily's taken care of, with the baby and all," and in that instant, the illusion shattered. They had no idea what had already been set in motion, no understanding that the power they thought they still held had already been signed away, restructured, and redistributed with brutal efficiency. Emily smiled softly, the way someone does when they're already mentally spending the inheritance. Ryan reached for the wine bottle like a man toasting his own future. I waited until the table was quiet. Then, without theatrics, I pulled out the updated trust summary, a simple 2-page printout with bullet points and plain language annotations. I placed it gently in front of my parents, letting the weight of paper do what my voice never could. As my father began reading, his expression shifted slowly, like someone trying to decipher a language they once knew but had long forgotten. My mother reached for her glasses, her mouth tightening as she scanned the fine print. Emily leaned forward, and when she found her name, in a footnote, attached to a clause about conditional disbursements pending board approval, her breath caught audibly. No one spoke for a long time. The silence stretched thin across the table like cellophane over a wound. I let it settle, let them sit with the truth, not just of the document but of everything it represented, every birthday forgotten, every favor denied, every dismissal disguised as pride. And when Emily finally looked up and asked, "What is this?" I answered with the same calm my parents had once used to deny me help. "It's just structure. You said you wanted things to be clear." The dinner ended early. There were no hugs, no goodbyes at the door, only the quiet scrape of chairs and the dull echo of choices coming home to roost. I drove back in the dark, the headlights carving a path through a world that, for the first time, felt aligned with my own sense of balance. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. I felt something colder, older, more permanent, like justice had finally stopped whispering and spoken aloud. And the look on their faces, when they realized the story had been rewritten and they were no longer the authors, was the only apology I was ever going to get.